for people who plan to apply for funds. So I think that's why you're here, because you're planning to apply for funds and you know that you need to be here. If for some reason something comes up and you need to leave, you can view the recording and still be eligible to apply. So the meeting is being recorded. The meeting will be shared out along with the slides. Um, and that will be posted on our website, our funding webpage. If you go to the Housing Alliance Delaware webpage, there's a CoC funding page. Sophie's going to add that to the chat sometime in the next few minutes so that you can take a look. But this meeting's the recording and the slides will all be added there for you to access at a later date and to reference. During our
Rachel,
presentations, please feel free to put questions in the chat. We'll either answer them there in the chat or maybe during a Q&A, save them for a Q&A, but we'll be monitoring that. And I just wanted to let folks know that AI and Zoom note takers are not permitted in the meeting unless they're needed for an accommodation of some kind, in which case, please do let us know. You can message to let us know. You can send a direct message to myself, to Sophia Castagna, or to Caitlin Del Calo, and we can make sure that you're able to get access. Um, and that's it for me. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Christy Rubenstein from Framework Strategies, who's going to start us off with what this NOFO says, means, and does when it comes to homelessness funding. So thanks, Christy.
I figured out how to unmute myself. There we go. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Rachel. I wanted to introduce myself, Christy Rubenstein from Framework Strategies, and my colleague, Raquel. Raquel, if you want to show yourself and say hi. Oh, I think you're muted too.
Hi, folks. I'll be supporting Christy on this call. Sorry about that.
So we're going to tag team a little bit. It's a lot of content to get through. Apologies in advance. It's a very dense presentation. We're going to try to move through it somewhat quickly because, there's more after we're done to hear about on the project side. So we will move through things pretty quickly, but as Rachel said, feel free to type questions into the chat. Folks will try to answer those questions, and we do have spots where we'll take a break to see if there are any questions that we should address along the way. So this presentation, what we're going to be talking about is we'll start with a high-level overview of the CoC sort of NOFO and the competition itself, talk through some key changes in this year's CoC NOFO. We'll talk a bit about HUD's goals and objectives, diving then into funding and tiering information, and then talking about the scoring of the CoC level application, and then some information related to projects. So starting with a high-level CoC NOFO overview, here's just a few key terms for those of you who are maybe a little less familiar with the Continuum of Care program. Just wanted to know, Continuum of Care is what we mean when we say CoC. The Continuum of Care, when we say CoC, we could mean either the Continuum of Care program, which is administered by HUD, or we could be referring to the local CoC. So if we're referring to the local CoC, we'll say the Delaware CoC or something like that. We'll try to specify. If it's a CoC program, we'll try to refer to the CoC program so that it doesn't get too confusing. Notice the funding opportunity is not a term we own, although we like to think we own it for the next 3 months. We'll talk about the NOFO as if this is the only one that exists, but there are many NOFOs out there. So, but that is what it means, a notice of funding opportunity. Renewal projects are projects that are currently receiving CoC program funds, and that can be renewed through this competition. And new projects are going to be projects that are not currently receiving CoC program funds and would be new to the community. Reallocation is a process by which funds are moved from existing/renewal projects to new projects. And then a term you're going to hear us use a lot is annual renewal demand, or ARD for short. And that is the amount of funds for a CoC to renew all existing projects. And we'll explain sort of like why that's important. But again, you'll hear us say that one a lot. A high-level overview, we'll start by saying local COCs apply to HUD for COC program funding through a continuum of care notice of funding opportunity competition, typically annually. The COC program funds are competitive, not like, say, ESG or CDBG or HOME, some other programs you may have heard of, which are sort of block grant programs or formula grant programs. COC program funds are competitive, and each COC has a max on the amount you're eligible to apply for, but only a portion of these are really guaranteed to come back to the community each year. Then we'll be talking about something called Tier 1 and Tier 2. The safe funds, the guaranteed funds to come back to the community are going to be those Tier 1 funds. As part of the CoC NOFO competition, COCs are going to submit renewal project applications and new project applications. So it'll be a mix of both. And prior to submitting the community's application to HUD for funding, the CoC is going to facilitate a local funding competition to determine which projects to submit. That will be done, the application will get submitted by your collaborative applicant, and that is Housing Alliance Delaware for your CoC. This local competition that is going to be sort of run by HAD, right, is going to involve two elements, really. One is evaluating the performance of existing / renewal projects, right, to determine which of those should be submitted to HUD for funding and how they will be ranked, and then or prioritized, and then soliciting and selecting new projects. So when HUD releases a NOFO, they tell us how much new funding is available to the CoC to apply for. The CoC may also reallocate funds from existing renewal projects and use that for new projects as well. We do not yet have the amounts confirmed from HUD in terms of the funds that are available for new projects, so we are waiting for that. Now, HUD uses a two-tiered system when awarding funds. I alluded to this earlier. There's Tier 1, those are our safe funds, and then there's Tier 2, which are the competitive funds. And if your project falls into this Tier 2 bucket, you're going to be competing nationally with all the other projects that fall into Tier 2 for all the other COCs across the country. And so each project will have to compete for that funding. Once the local CoC evaluates and selects the renewal and new project applications that it is going to submit to HUD, you're then required to rank them. So the CoC will go through a process of ranking each project. This is a numerical ranking, 1 to however many projects you're submitting. You start at the top and work your way down. This is how the CoC is going to convey to HUD what the CoC is prioritizing in terms of projects. So which projects does the CoC want funded first, and then all the way down the list. And you have to submit that to HUD, again, to let them know, because that's the list they're going to use. Once the CoC completes its ranking, some projects will inevitably be in Tier 1, and some are going to fall into Tier 2, and again, will be competing with all other Tier 2 projects across the country. So there are 3 sort of pieces of this application. It's called the consolidated application. The first major piece is the CoC level application. Again, that is going to be completed by your collaborative applicant on behalf of the entire community. And again, for your community, that's HAD. This is an application that is really asking system level questions. It's really operating at that higher level, talking about sort of your CoC's governance structure and how you do your work and your overall performance as a community, along with policies and strategies and plans, those kinds of things. This part of the application, this is scored in and of itself. And that scoring is going to be very determinative of the amount of funding that your CoC is going to receive, because it is used in this formula HUD has, which we'll talk about, related to those Tier 2 projects. Also, part of this application are all of the project applications that all of you who are interested in submitting an application would be working on. So that will be both renewal project applications and new project applications, and you would be the ones completing those. So if you are going to be submitting an application, a project application, you're going to go in and you're going to complete an application and say, this is what we plan to do in this project. Here is what we're requesting funding to do. And that's all the details of that, or that all of that detail will be in those project applications. Now, the CoC, like I said, is going to run a local competition. They're going to select which projects will move forward. If your project is accepted to move forward by the CoC, then you're going to go complete this project application in eSnaps. So just know there are kind of like two parts to this application process for all of you. You're going to respond to the local CoC's RFP, and then you're going to also have to complete a project application. That would be for new for the RFP. Priority listing is really another element of this, but it is the mechanism to take all those project applications that the CoC wants to submit to HUD and to deliver them to HUD. So the priority listing will be completed by the collaborative applicant, and it will include all the project applications that are going to be submitted. And it is the mechanism that the CoC would use to rank all of those projects and then tell HUD other information about the funding request in total, like, are we going to reallocate funds from existing projects, or what new projects are going to be submitted? All of that good stuff is included on the priority listing. All right, let's talk about highlights and key changes. So again, this year's application that includes both the priority listing and the CoC application. It's all due August 26th by 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There are these internal deadlines within the NOFO, established within the NOFO. CoCs must notify applicants, that is you project applicants, at least 15 days before that 8/26 deadline about whether your application has been accepted and it's going to be ranked, whether it was rejected, or if it was accepted but reduced and is still going to be on the priority list. So that information has to go out to you all by August 11th. And then within the NOFO, it also says that the CoC is supposed to post the full CoC application, including attachments and the priority list, on a website prior to the deadline, and let community members and stakeholders know that it's been posted. In past NOFOs, they wanted to see this done at least 2 days before the deadline, but that's not explicitly stated in this NOFO, so it just has to be posted before. And then the anticipated HUD award date for project applicants would be December 1st. That would be the date by which Congress actually set this as the date that they want HUD to announce awards by. Some key changes to this year's NOFO. So some of you might not really be familiar with past NOFOs, and so maybe some of this is less relevant, I guess. But for those of you who are more familiar with past NOFOs, there are some important things to know in terms of what has changed. So first and foremost, a big change to what's called, Tier 1 and Tier 2. So Tier 1 this year is set at 60% of the annual renewal demand. In 2024, it was 90%. In the 2025 NOFOs HUD put out, they had it at 30%. So we're kind of in the middle. Congress said HUD had to have Tier 1 at least 60% of ARD, and that is what HUD has adopted. Tier 2 is funding, again, competed for nationally. This one, the main factor here is that the merit review has changed a lot, and so that will impact the amount of funds that CoCs get in Tier 2. And so there's a lot of change to the merit review and a lot less certainty around for any CoC, really, in your competitiveness for Tier 2. There's no permanent housing cap. So this CoC, this NOFO, unlike the 2025 NOFOs, does not have the permanent housing cap that was set at 30% in those 2025 NOFOs, but that has been removed. And instead, HUD has established a sort of list that says we're going to award funds in this way and set aside funds for specific types of projects. And so we will walk through what that means and what it looks like. But the gist of it is that it's going to be very difficult for permanent housing projects that aren't in tier one to get funded. Also, HMIS projects that aren't in tier one will find it challenging to get funded. New projects, HUD is allowing and encouraging COCs to create new transitional housing and supportive services only projects. These had not been allowed in prior NOFOs for many years, but again, this administration is really wanting to see those project types and so encouraging submission of them. CoC bonus and reallocation funds are going to be available to use for those types of projects. The DV bonus still exists and can be used to create new SSOCE, rapid rehousing, and TH projects this year. And THRH renewals will be allowed, but this administration does not want to see any new THRH projects, and so no new THRH projects would be allowed to be submitted. And again, not necessarily a change from prior years. There have always been something called project quality thresholds, but what those project quality thresholds include have changed a lot in this NOFO. So if you are applying for a new project, just be aware that you have to meet these project quality thresholds, and they are quite different from prior years. On reallocation, again, HUD is continuing to strongly encourage reallocation. But they're going to be heavily scrutinizing projects as well to see if you meet their threshold and performance expectations. So those two will go hand in hand. The CoC will also probably be taking a closer look at those threshold and eligibility requirements just to make sure projects can pass those. Also of note, HUD released new guidance on participant eligibility to move participants from permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing into transitional housing. We see this as also HUD sort of nudging COCs to reallocate existing permanent housing into TH or SSO projects. And then major changes to the CoC application rating factors. There's a lot of stuff that is new this year, even different from what we saw in the fall. And again, a very big shift from what we saw in, say, 2024 to this year. HUD really focusing now on more than ever on program performance, but very data-driven there. Treatment, sober housing, investment in supportive services, service participation requirements, participant self-sufficiency, engagement with law enforcement, addressing encampments, quote unquote drug enablement programs and partnerships focusing on specific subpopulations and so on. So we will talk a little bit about what those things mean. I'm going to take a breath for questions. If any have come up that you have not addressed in the chat or wanted to say out loud.
Yeah, I have
Christy,
a
there were
question.
a couple in the chat that we were already able to address in the chat. So Jacqueline, sorry, was that you that was unmuting and trying to ask one verbally? I see your hands up.
Now, this is Michelle.
Okay, go ahead, Michelle.
Now, I don't think we've applied for this application before, so a lot of this stuff is new, what you're talking about. And the
Yep.
tier one and the tier two, I'm not quite getting what are the safe funds and the competitive funds? What's the difference? How do you go from a safe fund to a competitive fund, or from a competitive fund to a safe fund?
So you should think of it like you have a pot of money, right?
Uh-huh.
Some portion of that will definitely come back to the community. And some projects are going to be ranked because HUD requires COCs to look at all the projects you're submitting and rank them in order. And if you're ranked high, you will fall into tier one, and your project will get funded because it will be in that bucket of
Okay,
funds.
so it's depending on where you're ranked. Okay,
Yes.
gotcha.
So any project that is lower ranked risks being in tier two, and those funds are the ones that everybody has to compete for.
Okay, gotcha.
We'll talk about kind of the way they're doing this, but it is complicated.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Christy. Jacqueline, your hand's still up. Do you have a question?
Yes, I would like to ask, you're using a lot of acronyms that I'm not familiar with. And so when you say TH, that's transitional housing, I got that. But what is an SSO? And
We'll
then,
talk about that, but it's a supportive services only project. And these
okay,
are all just very specific types of projects that HUD has said can be created using these CoC program funds. So I believe we'll go into more detail later about what a supportive services only project might look like. There are a few different kinds that you could create, and get into that later in the presentation, if that's okay.
thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Anything else before Christy moves on to some more information?
I'm actually going to turn it over to Raquel to talk about HUD's goals and objectives.
Sounds good. Thank you, Christy. So we can go to the next slide. We're going to be talking through how HUD's goals and objectives have changed over time and what we see in this NOFO. So as you can see on this slide has three different sections. So what is on the left are the goals and objectives from the FY24-25 Notice of Funding Opportunity that was released during the last administration. And so there's some themes that were very emphasized in that Notice of Funding Opportunity that we don't see in the recent NOFOs. For example, topics related to racial equity, LGBTQ individuals, people with lived experience, using a housing first approach. Instead, HUD has shifted towards topics that you'll see in the FY 2025 NOFO as well as this 2026 NOFO related to improving outcomes, quote unquote, restoring balance, talking a lot about self-sufficiency and treatment and public safety. And so we're going to go into each of those with a little bit more detail on the next slides. Okay, so when it comes to improving outcomes, as Christy has mentioned, for many years, HUD has used different types of performance measures, and so that part isn't new. But I do think what HUD outlines in this specific goal and objective in this section of the NOFO, so there's a whole section on goals and objectives in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, is a real focus on outcomes specifically related to topics like self-sufficiency, reducing unsheltered homelessness and encampments. There's a strong emphasis on employment income. So historically, HUD has looked more holistically at income. So they might be looking at things like disability income or income from other sources, whereas this time around, HUD is really zeroing in on employment income. How well projects are promoting treatment and recovery. We'll talk a little bit more, but there's this new definition of self-sufficiency for how they're measuring projects. And then a big note here is that HUD is strongly encouraging continuums of care to fund new programs with the desire that, if there have been programs that have maybe not been performing well in the past, that maybe those funds should shift towards new programs, either through the reallocation process, an expansion grant, or a transition grant. And so HUD's perspective is that this might expand the pool of successful providers to maybe shift those funds to providers that might be able to administer with them differently and improve overall performance. And one thing to note that is a pretty dramatic shift in the last year and a half is that the federal government has really shifted towards transitional housing and supportive services only, and we'll talk more about that in upcoming slides. So if you can go to the next one, Christy. Okay, so as Christy mentioned, there's been a little bit of shift in what is competitive in this NOFO. So again, when it comes to driving outcomes, the federal government believes very strongly in wanting to increase competition, believing that more competition might lead to better applications and better programs. So there was this FY 2026 appropriations bill passed by Congress that set the minimum for what could be included in that SAFE funding, that Tier 1 funding. And so HUD has been consistent with Congress and is setting that SAFE Tier 1 funding at 60%. And so that means that communities are competing for the remaining funding based on how well they do when it comes to merit criteria. So how will they do on all those questions related to the continuum of care, compared to all of these other continuums of care. So this Tier 1 and Tier 2, that has been a consistent framework within the continuum of care NOFO for many years, but this 60% amount of safe funding is a little bit different. They want more competition than what was seen during past administrations. We saw in 2025 that they wanted only 30% to be safe. Congress forced them to bump that up to 60%, but they're still encouraging a significant portion of the funding that goes to communities to be competitive. So if we can go to the next slide. So there's this phrase throughout the NOFO when it comes to restoring balance to the continuum of care. We saw this also in FY 2025. One piece that they hope to restore balance on is that the continuum of care program used to administer funds for transitional housing and supportive services only. In previous administrations and previous NOFOs, those were not eligible project types. And instead, the strong focus was on permanent housing. This administration believes very strongly in wanting to reopen the ability to apply for those types of projects, believing that having transitional housing and supportive services only, in addition to the product types that have been allowed in recent years, would restore the continuum, is the quote that they have. Another piece that they emphasize very strongly is prioritizing permanent housing for people who will never be able to return to the workforce. And for folks who might be able to return to the workforce, there's a strong emphasis in this notice of funding opportunity when it comes to giving them treatment and services. HUD has deemed very strongly that they are hoping to shift people out of subsidized housing and not wanting to have longer term, quote, permanent housing programs available for those individuals. So this is a direct quote from the NOFO. HUD is shifting its focus from awarding nearly 90% of CoC funding to permanent housing to expand opportunities for other components of the CoC program. So we interpret this part that they really are trying to shift away and fund transitional housing and supportive services only at a much higher amount. We can go to the next slide. So this is back to the topic of treatment and recovery. So this NOFO encourages communities to invest in treatment services and recovery housing. There's a lot of new or slightly different criteria when it comes to how HUD is encouraging treatment services, recovery housing, expectations when it comes to drug use, things like that. There is a very significant section, both in, we'll talk about threshold criteria as well as merit criteria, on having programs that do not distribute drug paraphernalia or knowingly permit the use and distribution of drugs on their properties. HUD does make a very significant caveat that none of these expectations require programs to mandate that their participants be sober or participate in treatment, but they strongly, strongly encourage it. And there are many points throughout the notice of funding opportunity for programs that promote treatment and sobriety. And so again, there is a strong push for investment in treatment-focused beds. So there's, some formulas in the merit points of this application for if a certain amount of your beds are being dedicated to that require treatment, as well as encouragement of things like recovery housing, partnership with behavioral healthcare providers, partnership with drug courts, involuntary commitment programs, things of that nature. You go to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to talk quickly about this economic self-sufficiency. We already mentioned before that HUD is really shifting to focusing explicitly on employment. The main other note here is that they also are looking at exits to unsubsidized housing which is kind of a newer lens for the government to look at. And so there's a strong push for programs to be not only helping people move into housing, but then to help people move into unsubsidized housing. And then you'll see throughout the notice of funding opportunity that there's a strong push towards supportive services, supportive service investment, as well as supportive service participation requirements or agreements that participants would have to adhere to. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so there's a lot of questions, especially when it comes to street outreach, but also generally on how the continuum of care and programs like street outreach, how they cooperate with law enforcement or work alongside law enforcement. There's a strong push, one, to not have people sleep outside, but also to addressing safety concerns for the broader community that this administration believes might be associated with folks sleeping outside. And so HUD is asking CoCs to work with law enforcement, first responders, state and local governments with, three big focuses: reducing encampments, reducing public camping. We have a typo there that we should change, and then reducing public drug use. This one will be quick. There's this focus, and this has been in recent NOFOs as well, on reducing trauma with a specific focus on trauma for youth as well as for survivors of domestic violence. And the next slide. Okay. And then for this one, this is shown up both in the FY25 NOFOs as well as this FY26 NOFO. There's a strong push towards expanding access based on merit, but this section actually talks about ideology specifically, so wanting to ensure that faith-based providers feel like there is a level playing field to participate in the competition. There is specific language in this NOFO allowing faith-based providers to operate programs in alignment with their sincerely held beliefs. That language has not been in recent NOFOs. And then there is this big push that this NOFO prohibits the use of federal funds for, quote, any type of racial preferences with a specific focus on not having diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. You can go to the next slide. Okay, and I'll pass it back to Christy to get to funding and tiering information.
Thanks, Raquel. Yeah, let's dive into the funding part and talk about the amount of funds that might be available for your community to apply for and what you're sort of likely to bring home. So at least you're likely to bring home the Tier 1 funds. Those are the SAFE funds. That's going to be 60% of essentially the funding that you have now. Whatever it would take to renew all your existing projects, again, that's your annual renewal demand. So you would get to keep at least 60% of that. All projects are competitive, including DV bonus. You guys don't have what's called YHTP. Those are youth-specific grants. But everything's in the mix this year. Tier 2, again, is the difference between basically your ARD that's not in Tier 1, right? You're going to take that 40% that's left over, add to it what's called the CoC bonus, and then what's called the DV bonus. So CoC bonus is 15% of I'm sorry, I apologize for all these acronyms. I don't come up with these. 15% of final pro rata need, or FPRN, which is the higher of your annual renewal demand, or something called the preliminary pro rata need. The preliminary pro rata need is essentially a formula that's applied to geographies to say, if we were to take all of the funding HUD has available for this program and distribute it by this formula based on sort of populations and geographies, this is how much you should get. So for some COCs, that preliminary pro rata need is higher than their ARD, but not for your COC. And your COC, the annual renewal demand is actually a higher amount. So you would be using that. In addition, HUD has a set aside of $104 million in bonus projects specifically for survivors of domestic violence. So that money Congress has actually designated for projects that would serve survivors. And so it is kind of its own sort of special pot of money that can't be used for other kinds of projects. And the DV bonus amount that your COC could apply for is 20% of that preliminary pro rata need. So if your project were to end up in Tier 2, what happens to it, right? Well, essentially, HUD will take all the Tier 2 projects across the country and score them. And they lay out in the NOFO what the formula is for this. It's a maximum score of 100 points. And 50% of those points, or up to 50 points, are proportional to the COC's application score. So that's why we all want the CoC to do well on the CoC level application, because the higher you score on the CoC level application as a community, the more each project that is in Tier 2 for your CoC, the more of these points they're going to get. So you want to get as many of these 50 points as you can. And again, that's a lot of the points, is up to half the points just based on your CoC application score. If your CoC's application score is low, it's going to make your Tier 2 projects less competitive. The next bucket of points is up to 40 points based on how your project is ranked by your CoC. So again, there's a formula within the formula, interesting, convoluted formula maybe, but by design, what it does is it gives more points if a project is ranked higher. and less points if the project is ranked lower. And another factor is how much in funding is ranked above your project in tier 2. So those things impact the score that you would get here and how much of those 40 points your project would be eligible for. The next bucket of points is up to 10 points for projects that commit to a service participation requirement. Now, if you are submitting a SSO, a supportive services only, or a project specifically for the homeless management information system, those project types will get 10 points automatically. But if you are submitting a housing project, say transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, or rapid rehousing, you would have to commit to including service participation requirements to get these 10 points. This formula applies to any project in tier 2. For those of you who've been doing this a little longer, you might remember that DV bonus projects had a separate scoring formula. That is gone, and they will be scored just like any other tier 2 project. Now, there are no rules from HUD around what projects would go into tier 2. It could be renewals, it could be new projects, it could be projects created through a reallocation or the CoC bonus or the DB bonus. Everything is allowed. It's not restricted by HUD. There might be local community decisions about what will go into tier 1 and tier 2. But again, that's a local decision. So we're going to talk through HUD's order of funding. And this is on pages 90 and 91 of the NOFO, for folks who want to read through it. The total that HUD has available is $4.04 billion for this program. And it has grown over time, but mostly it grows over time because housing costs rise over time, and Congress is always kind of increasing the amount to keep up with rising housing costs. So the $4.04 billion is essentially replacing what was funded the prior year. There's not a lot of actual additional funding available. So of that $4.04 billion, HUD, again, there's no permanent housing cap here, but what HUD is going to do is they're going to go down this list and fund projects in this order. So the first thing they do is fund what's called the CoC planning grant, and you don't have to worry about the UFA part because you're not one. But the planning grant is basically a set aside of money for local CoCs to have to be able to do the work of all this competition and all the other work that HUD expects the community to do. So that gets taken out first. Then HUD will look at all the projects that are in tier 1 and that pass their project eligibility and quality thresholds. So that's going to be that 60% of annual renewal demand that we talked about. And they're going to go through and take their $4.04 billion, whatever's left after doing planning, and they're going to fund all of these tier 1 projects right off the bat, right? So that's why it's great to be in tier 1, your project gets funded. Now, the next step HUD will take is it will look at the DB bonus funds that it has available, and that's $104 million that is set aside, again, specifically for projects that are new projects applying under the DV bonus. So it will start back in tier 1 and look for any new DV bonus projects in tier 1, fund those, and then move into tier 2 DV bonus projects and start funding those until they run out of the $104 million. All right, the next step is that HUD will go back through tier 1 and look for projects that are permanent housing projects for families with children. These could be new projects or renewal projects. And so they're going to work their way through tier 1 and then into tier 2. They have $430 million set aside for these projects. But just to note that National Organization, National Alliance to End Homelessness has estimated that out there existing right now are about $900 million worth of projects that already do this, that are permanent housing for families with children. And so that $430 million that is a set aside could get used up pretty quickly in tier 1. We don't really know. It sort of depends on what HUD considers a PH project for families with children. Like, does it have to be dedicated to that population? Could it just serve them in any kind of way? We don't really know. So again, that $430 million could be used up pretty quickly before HUD even gets to tier 2, or there could be some left over in tier 2. We just don't know. All right, the next pot of money that HUD has set aside is 1.3 billion. So if we take out the DV bonus, that's a third of the funding left, right? But 1.3 billion for new transitional housing and supportive services only projects in tier 2. So here they're not going back through tier 1, they're only looking at projects in tier 2 and only projects that are new transitional housing and new supportive services only projects will be considered first under this, and then you'll go by score. So they'll work their way down all the tier 2 projects by score, looking for those new TH and SSO projects and funding those. The next thing they'll do is if they have any of this 1.3 billion left over, say they funded all the new TH and SSO projects that were in tier 2 and there was actually money left over, then they would start looking at other new projects in tier 2 and award those projects. Then the final step is if there are any funds left over at all, HUD will remove any new projects that are remaining in tier 2, rescore the projects that are left, which are going to be renewals, and then award those by new score until they have no funding left. So this is a very complicated scheme. It is layered. While there's no permanent housing cap, by the way they're awarding funds, what will happen is if you have a new permanent housing project, or honestly an HMIS project that is in tier 2, it will be difficult for it to get funded. And if you have a renewal in tier 2, it will be difficult for it to get funded. So these are the sort of key things to know in terms of competitiveness, what's likely to get funded by HUD, and how these funds are sort of being distributed. Now, I will just say this is new. This is something new in this NOFO. We've never seen HUD sort of give out funds in this way. So this is all new to us too. So if folks have questions, we can try to answer them. But again, this is not something any of us in the CoC world have been through before in this funding competition.
And Christy, I'll just add, I've looked at this slide a number of times and tried to understand it in detail. I wouldn't encourage folks to actually try to do too much of that and really just focus on the big takeaways that Christy has there bulleted on the left. It's going to be really important for the continuum of care funding committee and board members who are making funding decisions locally to understand some of this. But as an applicant, I think focusing on what it means, which is that projects in tier 1 should be renewals if we want any renewals to get funded, right? If there are renewals that we want to get funded, we should prioritize them to be in tier 1 because renewals in tier 2 are likely not to get funded. And tier 1 is only 60% of the money that we currently get, right? So as a renewal, that's information that you would want to focus on, what that means for your project and the potential for funding, just as an example. But I'll hand it back to you, Christy.
Yeah, and I'll just say, like, to your point, I think, again, like, those of us who do this full time are, wrapping our brains around this and it's like, okay. For those of you who are applicants, the main thing might be if you're wondering like, well, why is the CoC seeking these kinds of applications or not these kinds of applications? This is really the answer, right? Because some things are prioritized and some things are deprioritized. And so the CoC is going to be responding to HUD's sort of direction here in terms of the applications that it's looking for from all of you. So just be aware that it kind of flows through, and that's what you're going to maybe see in the RFP in terms of the kinds of applications the CoC is looking for this year. And again, some hard choices await the CoC. They have to determine which projects, again, are going to be in that 60% in tier 1, especially relevant to the renewals. Determine whether to replace existing permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing with the things HUD wants to see, like transitional housing and supportive services only projects. And then determine which projects will go into tier 2 and then in what order. So many decisions at the CoC level. In terms of the money, just kind of going through how much in funding the CoC currently gets, it's around 11.5 million. Tier 1 is 6.9 million, right? So that would be the safe money that's going to come back to the community. So you can already see like, oh, maybe losing a fair amount of money here through this competition if we don't get any Tier 2 projects. The CoC bonus that you could apply for is we're estimating here because we don't have the final numbers from HUD, but around 1.7 million, and a DB bonus of around 1.6 million. And a tier 2 that will be around 8 million, which is actually higher than your tier 1, right? So again, lots of decisions to make. The CoC does get a non-competitive planning grant. That'll be a little less than 600,000. In terms of what the current portfolio looks like, again, the bulk of the CoC's projects are in permanent housing of some kind. And so again, challenging decisions await. But you have about 73% of the funds in permanent supportive housing, around 15% in rapid, and 7% in the joint component TH to RH, which HUD does consider permanent housing for their purposes. There's one SSO CE for coordinated entry specifically, and one HMIS, both smaller, but again, just the CoC will be balancing that any renewal in tier 2 is not likely to get funded. And so these that are considered infrastructure will also be of concern to the CoC. All right, we'll talk a little bit about the CoC level application. Again, this is important, I guess, for generally for folks to know because how the CoC scores on the application has a big impact on the amount of funds that your community is going to be able to bring home. So there are 3 sort of main categories of points in this application: project ranking, review and capacity, system performance, and CoC coordination engagement. Some things that used to be scored have been moved into other sections, but for those of you who've been around a while, you might remember the housing and healthcare leverage. That's gone away entirely, and that's more about Congress not including it in the appropriations bill. Project capacity review and ranking is up to 14 points. And this is really about how the CoC runs its local competition. And HUD is also pushing CoCs to look at very specific things in terms of how you review projects and score them, including both renewal and new projects. So if you use a scoring tool, which HUD wants you to do, at least 50% of your points they want to be see are objective criteria. They want at least 25% of the points to fall into this group of criteria that are related to what's called the system performance measures. And then they want to see that you have points for considering returns to homelessness, employment income, and supportive service participation requirements. So you're going to see all of those things either in the renewal scoring or the new project scoring tool because the CoC is trying to meet these targets. The CoC also is supposed to consider factors such as financial stability, performance history, capacity, audit findings, and public complaints. So you might also see the CoC ask about those very specific things. The rest of this is ranking and selection process is again about like, did the CoC notify you all by that August 11th deadline that HUD has established? And did they give you reasons if your project was rejected and things like that? And reallocating projects, they have a threshold of they want to see 20% of funds reallocated over the last, I think it's 5 years. If you don't hit that target, you can kind of say what you've been doing to look at projects and consider them for reallocation. But you're probably not guaranteed the full points. We have been in the past, but unknown moving forward. System performance are 64 points in this category. A lot of it is heavily weighted to data and a lot of points for some very specific things, very different from prior NOFOs. 20 points alone for reducing the number of homeless individuals and families, 8 points for reducing encampments, and 12 points for jobs and income growth. So those points are, again, this is a lot about your data and very little about strategy. In terms of unsheltered homelessness, they're looking at PIT data. They're looking at PIT data from this year compared to last year, compared to the year before. for unsheltered homeless individuals and families. They're looking back to 2018 or 2019 even, right? So a lot of points here for have you reduced unsheltered homelessness over time? And then also chronic homelessness, and then the combined sheltered and unsheltered population. Additionally, they have 8 points for reduction in the number of encampments or the number of people residing in encampments. So all of this is like worth about 28 points total. Very heavy emphasis again on data. And then system performance measures related factors include heavy emphasis again on jobs and income growth. So we look at this for projects that are currently participating in the CoC. And unfortunately, many of you probably have worked with your clients to increase their unearned or non-employment income. HUD is not looking at that at all. They really just want to see increases in income from employment. Returns to homelessness, HUD's looking at returns over a longer period of time, 12 months and 24 months now. And then again, Raquel mentioned the successful exits from assistance. They want to see that people are exiting TH, RH, and PSH to unsubsidized housing. And then there's a de-emphasis just in general on things that might have been emphasized in the past, like your CoC strategies or length of time homeless. Just again, not something that this administration is emphasizing. And then they've added some new stuff in terms of like unit utilization and to reduce the rate of exits to unknown destinations for those of you who are participating in HMIS. In terms of the 122 points for CoC coordination and engagement, that falls into 3 sort of buckets: accountable structure and participation, community coordination, and coordination to serve subpopulations. So we'll take a quick look at the representative governance board in one in particular, because that will influence maybe the future of your governance board and who is on it. But again, keep in mind that this is HUD's way of saying, hey, we want to see a governance board that reflects who we think should be on a governance board. And for them, that includes 1 person with lived experience, but also 3 elected public officials. And then they want to see that you have folks from these various sort of stakeholder communities: business community, law enforcement, recovery housing, sober living provider, behavioral primary health provider, workforce development, and local court system managing treatment, civil commitment, specialty courts. So some of these might already be on your board, but some of them might not, and you're going to want to be thinking about that as a community. Again, the community coordination section, there are a lot of points for some very specific things, and big kind of heavy weighting going to treatment and recovery services, supportive services between these 2 areas, and then protecting public safety, and then points for some of these other things, which certainly HUD cares about, but you can see, again, treatment and recovery very heavily weighted, and then this idea of supportive services being a big part of the applications that come in. So treatment and recovery, I am not going to read through all of this. This is a lot of stuff. You'll get the slides and trust folks can read through. But the gist of it is that HUD wants to see certain types of projects with a heavy emphasis on treatment and recovery, and treatment being available on site, treatment being required, detox and inpatient treatment, right? So lots of sort of things here. Also, just to note, they don't really define how you're earning these 20 points. So unclear in some cases how you would, if like say substance use treatment is available on site for at least 30% of the projects, is worth 5 points, 3 points, 1 point, who knows, right? So they haven't really defined that. So again, the CoC is going to be looking maybe for more projects that do this because they want to try to get these points. But again, unclear how you're actually accruing the points. The other thing to know is that they want to see a lot of partnerships here, right? A lot of partnerships with other sectors that serve this population that you're working with. Some of these are relationships you already have. Some of them might be new. So again, they're asking a lot of questions on the CoC level about how does the CoC have these partnerships, and are you submitting projects that kind of really reflect what HUD wants to see. In terms of supportive services, just be aware that HUD both wants to see that projects submitted have a very healthy supportive services budget, or have a pretty healthy services budget and can leverage services from elsewhere. So they're going to want to see that. And then they also want the CoC to push for all projects to require service participation within the project. So they incentivize that. It's not outright required, but if you submit that 100% of the projects that are submitted have service participation requirements, you'll get more points than if you only say about half of them do. And there's extra language here for folks to read through about sort of like what HUD would consider a service participation agreement. So that is also something to read through, but they're kind of taking a line that, for example, they give the example of the requirement that exists currently for rapid rehousing, which is that the participant meets with a case manager at least once a month, and they're saying that would count as a service participation requirement. So that could be considered a pretty light lift. And again, we would encourage folks to read through this. I'm sure it's covered in the RFP. Protecting public safety is another area that Raquel mentioned. And again, what HUD is really wanting to see is that both the CoC and sort of projects are going to cooperate and not interfere with law enforcement, that the CoC is working to clearing tents and encampments and decreasing the public use of illicit drugs, all of these things. Also involve things like involuntary commitment. They want to see the CoC talking about standards for that, and also sharing information related to sex offender registry and notification and things like that. So that all falls into this bucket. Again, worth a lot of points on that CoC level application. In terms of working the coordination to serve subpopulations, this used to be something that was in prior NOFOs, a look at serving specific subpopulations. They've expanded the list a bit. This is a mix in terms of the CoC level application of HUD wanting to see that you have partnerships to serve these populations. Also, in some cases, they want to see very specific types of projects that will serve these populations. Sometimes they want to see that it's a CoC funded project, sometimes just a project you already have that doesn't have to be CoC funded. So it's a bit of a mix, but it's kind of partnerships and proposed projects that will help the CoC to accrue points here. In terms of the sort of bonus points that HUD makes available, so they make two sets of bonus points available, what they call policy initiative preference points. The first is for the CoC using at least 50% of the award in opportunity zones. Kind of challenging, to be honest, because opportunity zones are limited in most places, but you could get 4 points for that. And then the other part of this is advancing recovery by prohibiting illicit drug enablement. So the CoC could earn up to 10 bonus points by having a policy or statement to ensure all housing projects will not operate drug injection sites or safe consumption sites, knowingly distribute drug paraphernalia, knowingly permit the use or distribution of illicit drugs, or conduct, encourage, or allow these activities under the pretext of harm reduction. There's a lot more specific language if you have questions about that in the NOFO. Again, they say this doesn't constitute a requirement that the participants have to be sober to receive assistance or be evicted for first-time violations, but they do want to see that the policy outlines sort of what the remedies would be if a project was in violation and all of these things here. I see somebody's asking about Narcan, and that is unknown. We would probably suggest submitting a question directly to HUD. I believe there was some language given to folks who are working with veterans, maybe SSVF or something like that, where it was kind of like you can't distribute it. Or some such thing, like you could have it and give it to somebody, but you couldn't distribute it. So it might be very nuanced, and I would suggest folks reach out to HUD directly with that question. Key takeaways from that merit review, though, that's how the CoC application is being scored. Very high expectations for getting points, and a lot less clarity on how the points will actually be awarded. So the CoC will be working to meet all of those expectations as much as it can, but it is a very challenging bar to meet in some cases. The NOFO uses the merit review to incentivize the things HUD wants to see. That includes treatment-oriented, preferably on-site kinds of projects, TH and SSO over permanent housing, shifting resources to fund services more than we've kind of ever gotten that from HUD before, and projects focused on specific subpopulations. Again, a lot of points in that sort of public safety bucket. So again, encampments, public camping, public use of illicit drugs, and then new expectations for CoC activities and partnerships. Law enforcement, crisis response, and first responders, they want us to see us work with. Specialty courts, that one wasn't really in the 2025 NOFOs that much, but a lot in here about specialty courts and involuntary commitment programs, family reunification, employment at workforce development programs, certainly, and then our behavioral health related providers in that work. All right, I'll take a breath for questions and then try to get through the next part pretty quickly.
And
How
before
much does,
folks,
go ahead.
one moment, Michelle. Before folks jump in with questions, just as a reminder, we are going to get to more information about what you need to do as an applicant. All of what Christy is sharing is more like context to understand why you see what you see when you look at our application and when you see what the funding decisions end up being. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, how much does Delaware generally get from this fund? How much did we get last year? Do you know that?
Last year we got about 12 million. And the year before that, about 11.5.
Out of the four some $billion?
Yes.
That doesn't seem like a lot. I don't know why that it doesn't seem like a lot.
There are about like maybe a little somewhere around 400, maybe 350 to 400 CoCs throughout the country. So the money has to be spread, across everybody
Right,
across the country.
right.
All right.
Hi, my name's Denise. Oh,
Okay.
hello. Hi, I'm Denise. I have a question. When you were speaking about performance, so because mine is a new program, but I'm partnering with um two other nonprofits currently, and we're going to be working on some other partners. So when you're talking about that 5-year performance, can it be their performance? Since my project is a new project and it doesn't have a history to show a 5-year window of performance, past performance.
I see Rachel nodding yes.
Well,
Oh,
no, I
okay.
just mean
I'm at work and I'm on the phone and now I couldn't see.
that's okay. Well, I'm
I
nodding to
couldn't see.
say it's a little
Okay.
some of it's a little contradictory. Like you will see some things in the project application that we put out or that HUD's asking for in the NOFO that's asking about performance related to new projects, which is a little bit confusing. What we're doing at the local level is asking people who are submitting for brand new projects that aren't operating yet to talk about their goals and how they plan to achieve certain things. We'll also be asking folks if they're looking for funding that maybe the CoC funding is new, but the program has been operational for some time, to
Uh,
talk to us about what they've been achieving in that program, because that would have been operating just without the CoC funds. But there's different ways that we're looking at that in the
Okay.
process.
And the second part of my question is, um, if we were to receive the funding this year one, and when next year's allocations come through, but our program has expanded, are we allowed to ask for more funding or is it the same funding? Like if we go from 12 residents and then the next year we go up to 48 residents, does that open us up to more funding or not?
So typically this is an annual competition, so you'd get a 1-year contract and you'd be sort of obligated to serve the number of people and get funding to serve that number of people. In future years, if HUD makes funding available competitively again, which we would expect they would do, then you could come in again and apply for what's called an expansion grant to expand your existing project and ask for more money. But again, that has to go through the same sort of application process. in the next
Okay.
kind of competition year.
All right. Thank you.
I'm gonna
I'll also just add just the first part of what Christy said could have been interpreted, I think, maybe to mean like if you say you're going to serve 12, you can only serve 12, and that's not what she meant. I just want to be clear, like you just have to at least serve 12 people, and obviously if you end up serving more people, that's great. Um, it's not limiting you to only serving 12 people.
That's true. You HUD will want you to serve at least the amount that you say you're going to serve in your application. I'm
Okay.
going to
All
turn
right.
it
Thank you.
I'm going to turn it over to Raquel to talk through quickly. I guess we'll try to go through this stuff pretty quickly. The project threshold criteria for those of you who are submitting a renewal or a new project. This is very relevant information. So please tune in.
Yeah. Thank you, Christy. Sorry, I had to clear my throat. When it comes to project threshold criteria, there has been what's called a threshold review in past notice of funding opportunities. However, what HUD is reviewing in this threshold review has changed a bit in this NOFO, so we're going to talk about it. When it comes to projects, there are threshold criteria that apply to all projects. And real quick, threshold criteria are what HUD looks at to even determine if they're going to consider a project. So you would want your project to, quote, pass threshold review in the federal government's process of reviewing in order to even be considered for funding. And so there are some broad expectations that apply to all projects. So they apply to new and renewal projects alike. Some of those topics might be if your organization or this project have a past history, both with the CoC grant process, but also potentially HUD might look at if you receive other federal grants or whether you've had weird performance on grants in general. So they're going to look at, does your agency or does this project have unresolved monitoring? Do you have investigations going on? Have you been drawing down funds on a regular basis? Have you been submitting APRs, which is a type of report, on a regular basis? So those are some of the considerations that get looked at for all projects. Then there are some eligibility, capacity, timeliness, performance standards that get looked at for renewal projects. So some of those considerations that I think might be on the next slide are related to, did this project meet its goals? Is this project, kind of checking some of HUD's basic boxes for what renewal projects should be doing? And then one of the areas that we have seen change pretty significantly in the last couple of years is for new projects. So there are not only some of these considerations just of like, have you been able to manage grants or could you manage a grant well in the future, but also questions specifically to the type of project. So the way HUD is going about that is, for example, they might give you would have to get 3 out of 5 points on the threshold review for supportive services only if you're applying for supportive services only. And so all of this threshold review process is very important for you to take a look at in the NOFO. I can drop the page numbers in the chat once we get through with this section, but you want to make sure that your product will pass threshold review. And it'll also be important at the local level to make sure a project will pass threshold review so that the local competition is not kind of wasting a slot by proposing a project that's not going to make it. If we can go to the next slide. So these are some of the general project threshold eligibility questions. So, does your program meet requirements? Do you have the financial and management capacity to even administer a federal grant? Are you willing to participate in HMIS? So that, shared database for homelessness data. And then there's 2 questions that I think is very important to flag as being part of this threshold review. So one, your product would have to certify that you as an applicant will not engage in, quote, racial preferences or other form of illegal discrimination. Now, keep in mind that the federal government has talked about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, as a form of illegal discrimination. So that's something to consider, and if you have a legal team, might be something to review. And then they bring back up this topic of drug enablement. And so you would have to certify that your project will not operate drug injection sites, safe consumption sites, knowingly distribute drug paraphernalia, do any of this under the guise of like harm reduction. And then one thing that's been added that is new in this NOFO is that HUD reserves the right to verify past performance and evaluate the eligibility of project applications to make sure that applicants can manage the awards. That's kind of normal, but one thing that is important that has changed since the last NOFO is HUD claims they will not penalize applicants for complying with the terms and conditions of prior HUD grant awards. So, for example, previous snowfos, there was a lot of concern of, okay, well, past administrations were really pushing for things like racial equity, housing first, engaging with folks who identified as LGBTQ and having targeted strategies. So HUD has claimed in this section that they're not going to ding you if you were meeting an expectation or something that you were encouraged to do in a past grant. So if we can go to the next slide. So these are some of those differences between renewal projects and new projects. If you are a renewal project, keep in mind that HUD reserves the right to look through ELOCs, your APRs, talk to the field office, look at monitorings and audit reports. The big thing they're going to look at is whether your performance met grant plans and goals. Again, timeliness standards, performance and participant self-sufficiency. So they're probably going to be looking at how well you increase employment income and move people on into housing, potentially unsubsidized housing. And then general grant management concerns like having outstanding arrears, audit findings, capacity issues. One thing I will flag is if you have in the past ever served an ineligible client or had an eligible cost, that could be a reason why HUD would throw out your application. And then for new projects, some of the things they'll consider is if you maybe are applying for a new project, but you currently receive continuum of care funds or you have in the past, they're going to look at a lot of those same considerations. And then if you maybe are looking into an expansion project, like what Christy was mentioning, where you're wanting to get more funds than you currently do, and you're going to expand your project, then you would have to demonstrate that that's not replacing other funding sources. In the next slide. So like I mentioned before, there are requirements in the NOFO that have been there for many years that all applicants will have to participate in coordinated entry. And then separately, if you are a victim service provider, you would have to have a comparable process. And then same thing for HMIS participation. So you would have to participate in HMIS or a comparable database if you're a victim service provider. If you can go to the next slide. And then one thing that I think is important to note, we've talked a lot about supportive service requirements. I know there were some comments in the chat asking, what would that look like? One thing that we wanted to flag is that this NOFO does clearly state that recipients as well as their subrecipients, so if you are applying or anyone that you're subcontracting with, you can require program participants to take part in supportive services. However, it'd have to be supportive services that are not disability related. And so those disability related services might be mental health services, things like that, that are focused on people who have a disability, and it's to address that condition. The one caveat is that if the purpose of the project is to provide substance use treatment, the program can require participants to take part in treatment. So you'll see kind of scattered throughout the NOFO that there are either bonus points or it's strongly encouraged for programs to consider requiring treatment in their program, and that is allowed. And if we can go to the next slide. And then the last thing that I think is important to highlight is that this slide covers the types of projects that HUD is really pushing for, what they are incentivizing, potentially prioritizing. So we have those funds that Christy talked about that are set aside for specific types of projects. So for example, if you were interested in operating a transitional housing project or a supportive services only project, there are funds earmarked for those projects, and HUD is strongly pushing for organizations and CoCs to consider those types of projects. There is that bucket of funding for permanent housing for families with children. Now, that pot could go to renewal projects that already are prioritized for families with children, or it could go to new projects. But it is encouraged that if you're operating a permanent housing site, HUD is really shifting focus specifically on families with children. And there's a couple other considerations in the NOFO. There's that domestic violence bonus funding that's earmarked, and then I think some of those merit points that Christy talked about are also important at the project level. So the entire continuum of care might need to check some of those boxes. There's also a lot of questions related to, what percent of applicants offer substance use treatment on site. So in the NOFO, they want to see at least 30% of applicants having substance use treatment. Same thing for, there's an expectation that there be at least one sober housing program, things of that nature that you can see on this slide. And that Christy's already talked about, but if you're considering applying for funds, looking at whether your project either might be able to get some of those set aside funds or might be able to help the continuum of care get merit points are strong considerations to think about. Okay, and I'm going to pass it back to Christy.
Okay, I know we have a lot to get through, so I'm going to run through some of these things very quickly, but note that all of this is available to you in different places. We have links throughout here where you can go and explore further, either through the CoC interim rule or what's called the CoC binder. But again, we have links to these resources. So what can you ask for in terms of funding? Well, within the CoC program, you can ask for funding for rental assistance, leasing, operating, supportive services, HMIS, VAWA costs, and administrative costs. Technically, you can ask for funds for acquisition, new construction, and rehab, but most CoCs don't allow for that because that funding is not renewable in future years, and there are lots of strings attached. It becomes very difficult, actually, to use those funds. So moving forward, there are various restrictions that we suggest folks read through what's called the CoC interim rule. That is the regulation that basically we'll have to comply with if you're using CoC funds. I would suggest looking through subpart D for all those sort of little things to make sure that your project and your agency can sort of meet the obligations and understands the restrictions on these funds. There is also a CoC binder, again, very helpful. One thing I did flag in this NOFO is that HUD says they will consider requests to waive requirements related to kitchen and bathroom being in the unit, meaning you could have, say, like an SRO type project. However, what wasn't waived, that it is in the CoC interim rule, is that you have to have a bedroom for every 2 participants. So if you're thinking about a TH that has a dorm style housing situation or like barrack style housing, might not be allowed, depends. We'll see and know more, I think, as things unfold. But again, you'll look through that new project RFP to see more about what is and isn't allowed and what your CoC is looking for. Match, I know this came up in the chat. Yes, CoC projects have to have a 25% match. If you're asking for leasing funds, you can back that out of that calculation. But basically what counts as match is anything already eligible under the CoC interim rule and that you pay for through other funds. Again, there's a whole section on this thing called the CoC binder that talks about match. Allowed budget line items include operating, leasing, and rental assistance specifically to pay for housing costs. So operating funds are most useful if you own the site. Leasing funds, that's if you want to enter into the lease with the landlord and then have the participants enter into an occupancy agreement or a lease or something with you. There is a restriction if you own the property, so be aware of that. You're not supposed to use leasing for property that you own. You can ask for an exception, but it can't be just you. It's if any subsidiary or any partner organization, all these things in that part of the interim rule. So again, read through that. Rental assistance, there are 3 types: tenant-based, sponsor-based, and project-based. Sponsor-based, kind of difficult to use. Most folks will use tenant-based, some project-based. Under the model, again, the participants entering into the lease directly with the landlord, and that you're going to use those CoC funds to pay for 30%, or so they pay 30%, you pay the rest. So rental assistance cannot be combined with operating, and be aware of this guidance that was stressed by HUD recently, that nonprofits, while they are allowed to administer rental assistance in permanent housing projects, they are not allowed to administer rental assistance directly in transitional housing projects. You could partner with a local or state government agency or a public housing authority to administer rental assistance under a subrecipient or subcontractor agreement, but you cannot administer it directly yourself. And there's probably more information in the RFP about that. When might you use what? Well, again, if you're applying for a rapid rehousing, only tenant-based rental assistance is going to be allowed. If you're applying for TH, just be aware of that limitation on rental assistance administration. If you own the building, you're probably going to heavily consider operating. If you want to, again, be sort of the middleman between the tenant and the landlord leasing. And if you don't want to be that middleman, rental assistance. Supportive services, lots of things are allowed in the CoC interim rule, but you really need to carefully read through it because there's some things they're very specific about what you can use the funds for. And then keep in mind, supportive services must be necessary to assist program participants to obtain and maintain housing. So that's just a rule within the rule. Admin specifically for some costs related to general management, oversight, coordination, training, and environmental review. You can only ask for up to 10% of the project cost. And note that admin is maybe not what you think. There are a lot of things that are related to administering, say, rental assistance. If it's a cost related to administering rental assistance, that gets paid for out of the rental assistance budget, not the admin budget. And likewise with supportive services, with leasing or operating, those things get paid for out of those eligible cost categories and not out of admin. So just be aware of that. HMIS, if the CoC is going to let you ask for that, it could be used to cover costs of participating in HMIS. But the HMIS lead is the only one that can ask for all of the HMIS costs. And VAWA, most of you will not need to put any money into this line item. It will be sitting there. You might wonder what it is. Well, it's mostly for the VSPs, victim service providers, who might need to use funds to facilitate emergency transfer plans or to comply with the Violence Against Women Act confidentiality requirements. Eligible costs and the CoC interim rule, some things to know. Read the rule. That's all I can just say this, read the rule. Be aware of what you can and can't do with this funding. Anything not stated in the rule as allowed is not an eligible cost. So if the rule doesn't say you can do it, then you should assume you can't. Remember that you need to document expenses to bill for them, and CoC funds can only be used to pay for expenses related to serving project participants. So just be aware of that. You might have to prorate your kind of costs for something if they're serving non-participants. And then you have to provide that 25% match. So even if something you could use CoC funds for something, you might think about whether to still look for a partner to provide it as match. Participant eligibility, if you are not familiar with the CoC program, there are categories of homelessness. Category 1 is literally homeless. Category 2 is folks who are at imminent risk of homelessness within 14 days. Category 4 is those who are fleeing domestic violence. And there is special HUD guidance now about if you have a permanent supportive housing project and you're going to end that project and you might need to move people into transitional housing, how those folks might qualify. So suggest people read that. In terms of who is eligible for what, TH, Rapid, the Joint Component, and SSO projects, you're going to folks who meet the categories 1, 2, or 4 are eligible. DV bonus projects, it's categories 1 or 4. Transition grants, just be aware if you have an existing project, the transition grant option is still there. You can reallocate your existing project and transition to the new type over a 1-year period. Eligible new projects are going to be the same ones that are allowed through the competition. Most of you would be looking at, say, a PSH to a TH transition. That's going to probably be the most likely path. It has to be the same recipient and you have the same amount of money to work with. DV bonus, very briefly, again, that $104 million nationally is available for your local community. I think what the math was like 1.6 million, something like that. Again, that same tier 2 formula. So if you have a new DV bonus project in tier 2, the same formula that applies to all other projects will be used. What's eligible, rapid rehousing and transitional housing. And then the CoC could submit up to 1, but only 1, supportive services only for coordinated entry. Please note that under the DV bonus, the only supportive services only type of project allowed is that SSOCE, no standalone or street outreach under the DV bonus. And then if you have a existing DV bonus project you want to reallocate, that's fine, but the CoC would use those funds to create only new DV specific projects. And then if you are a victim service provider, just be aware that you're going to have to enter data into an HMIS comparable database. I am done. I can take questions, but happy to also turn it over to the HAD team.
Hello.
Yep, Jacqueline, go ahead. And then we are just going to move straight on, even if folks have questions, to make sure we get through some of the
Um,
local stuff. Go ahead,
I
Jacqueline.
was in a previous meeting yesterday with the local CoC administration, and I had a question, and they said I should bring it up now. And that is for the match, 25% match. What other than dollars can qualifies towards that match?
So a lot of things could count as match. So say you're working with a local food bank and they provide food to the participants in your program. You could look at that. You could look at behavioral health services or mental health services. Again, you could look at a whole range of things that might count as match. And it doesn't have to be cash. It can be in-kind services. What you're
Yeah.
going to want to do is make sure that you have an actual agreement with that provider to provide that match. You don't have to have a formal MOU or anything at this point, but a letter indicating like, yes, they talked to us and we're committed to providing this for these participants would be probably might be necessary for you to submit your application. We don't know yet. The CoC might be asking for that too.
Okay, thank you very much. So volunteer services, things like that, hours of volunteer services would qualify?
Depends. It has to only things that the CoC funds could pay for would be eligible. So it depends on what those volunteers would be doing.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Is everybody seeing the screen that says fiscal year 26, Delaware 500?
Yes.
Okay. Once you hit slideshow and your screen sharing, it's hard to tell what people can see. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Caitlin Delcalo. I am the still relatively new CoC program director. So I am going to talk now about the new project applications that the Delaware CoC is accepting under our RFP. Okay, let me find my controls. Okay, so under the RFP, which is already posted on our funding website, we are accepting the following new project type applications. The first is transitional housing. You can also apply for transitional housing under the DV bonus. So that would be a transitional housing project that is serving victims of domestic violence. We are also accepting new project applications for supportive services only street outreach. The shorthand for that is SSOSO. We are accepting new project applications for supportive services only standalone, that is SSO. And then only under the DV bonus will we accept new project applications for rapid rehousing and the SSO CE, which is that supportive service only coordinated entry that Christy was just talking about. Because of the way in which HUD intends to fund projects, it is very unlikely that new supportive housing projects will get funded. And so the Delaware CoC has made a decision to not solicit new PSHA projects at this time. However, if funds become available through our reallocation process, we may at that point consider new permanent supportive housing projects. So to support that planning, we have created an interest form for agencies to complete, and that will give us an idea of whether there are people that would be potentially interested in providing that, and if so, what their capacity is. That interest form is linked to in our RFP, which again is already on our website. I'm going to ask my colleague Sophie to drop it in the chat because I can't even see the chat anymore. All right, so now I'm going to give a brief overview of each of the project types that you can apply for. And then I'm also going to talk about the project quality thresholds that are specific to each project type. So first up is transitional housing. Transitional housing projects can cover housing costs and accompanying supportive services for program participants for up to 24 months. Participants served in a TH project have to have a signed lease, sublease, or occupancy agreement that includes an initial term of at least 1 month that is automatically renewable upon expiration unless either party gives prior notice, and a maximum term of 24 months. Per HUD, participants can remain in a project past 24 months if appropriate permanent housing has not been identified or if more time is needed. However, HUD may discontinue transitional housing funding for a project if more than half of the households served have exceeded that 24 months. So we've mentioned these thresholds many times in this presentation. So these are the thresholds that are specific to each project type. So for transitional housing, if you are submitting a new application, you have to get at least 6 out of 8 points under project quality threshold in order to be eligible for CoC funding. So this gives you the breakdown of that. It goes on to another slide. So HUD will award 2 points for TH projects that demonstrate that they will provide or partner with others to provide supportive services that are necessary to obtain and maintain housing. They will assign 1 point for applicant that has prior experience operating transitional housing or other projects where homeless individuals have exited within 24 months. If an applicant does not have that prior experience, they can still get a point if they demonstrate that they have a plan in place to ensure that homeless individuals served by their project will exit homelessness within 24 months. There's 1 point available again for an applicant that has previously or currently operates transitional housing or has a plan in place for such a project in which at least half of participants exit to permanent housing within 24 months, and at least 50% of participants exit with employment income as reflected in HMIS, which here locally we call CMIS. There's 1 point available for projects for demonstrating that your project will be supplemented with resources from other public or private sources, which can include mainstream benefits such as food stamps, Medicaid, Medicare, etc. There's 1 point available for demonstrating that your average cost per household served is reasonable, consistent with that HUD regulation. And then the last 2 points are available if you can describe how your project will assess the service needs of program participants and provide individualized services to those program participants that results in at least 20 hours per week of engagement in services, activities, or employment for all program participants, except participants that are over the age of 62 or for an individual that lives with handicaps as defined in 24 CFR 8.3, or with a developmental disability as defined in 24 CFR 578.3. Employment can contribute to the 20 hours per week of engagement. And then furthermore, you also have to indicate that the project will create service plans for each participant. Those service plans have to include what services will be provided, when and how often, by whom the services will be provided. And then it also has to include program participant goals, strategies for achieving those goals, and target dates for achievement to focus on improved health and wellness, housing stability, increased employment income, leading to financial stability and self-sufficiency. Okay, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions so far. Okay, none. All right. So the next category for new project applications that we are accepting is supportive services only street outreach, or SSO. These are projects that allow recipients to provide supportive services, such as conducting outreach to sheltered and unsheltered homeless persons and families, and providing referrals to other housing or necessary services. And we have a quote here from the CoC interim rule about the allowed activities and costs. So the outreach services, the cost of activities to engage persons for the purpose of providing immediate support and intervention, as well as identifying potential program participants, are eligible. Eligible costs include the outreach workers' transportation costs and a cell phone to be used by the individual performing outreach. And then it also lists component activities and services, which include an initial assessment, crisis counseling, addressing urgent physical needs, such as providing meals, blankets, clothing, or toiletries, actively connecting and providing people with information and referrals to homeless and mainstream programs, and publicizing the availability of housing or services provided within the CoC. For this project type, HUD is saying that you have to receive at least 5 out of 6 project quality thresholds in order to be considered for funding. Luckily, these all fit on one slide. So HUD will award 1 point if the project demonstrates that it'll be supplemented with resources from other public or private resources. Again, that includes things like SNAP, Medicare, Medicaid. 2 points are available if the proposed project has a strategy to provide supportive services to persons with histories of unsheltered homelessness and those who do not traditionally engage with supportive services. They will award 1 point to applicants that demonstrate that they have a history of or a plan for partnering with first responders and law enforcement to engage people that are living in places not meant for human habitation so that those persons can access emergency shelter, treatment programs, be reunited with family, or get into transitional housing or independent living. The applicant must cooperate, assist, and not interfere or impede with law enforcement when they are enforcing local laws such as public camping and public drug use laws. There's 1 point available for demonstrating experience with providing outreach services or a plan for providing such outreach services specifically geared towards helping people successfully exit from places that are not meant for human habitation into emergency shelter, treatment programs, transitional housing, or permanent housing. And then last but not least, 1 point is available for demonstrating that the services provided are cost effective. Our next project type is supportive services only standalone, or SSO. SSO projects are designed to provide supportive services to sheltered and unsheltered homeless persons and families. Generally, a recipient of an SSO project cannot also provide housing or housing assistance to program participants in that project. And all supportive services, as Christy mentioned before, must help program participants obtain and maintain housing. Additionally, services provided through an SSO project cannot be limited to participants in specific housing projects. They've got to be made available to any eligible household within the CoC. And this slide shows you SSO eligible activities and costs. This looks exactly like Christy's slide from earlier because I copied it from her. So thank you, Christy. But again, I do encourage folks to actually read the interim rule to see all the details and caveats. So for SSO standalone projects, you have to get at least 4 out of 5 points in order to be eligible for funding. So the first point is given for a project that is such that the supportive services provided are necessary to assist people exiting homelessness, addressing barriers to stable housing, so things like substance use disorder, unemployment, childcare needs, and increasing self-sufficiency. Additionally, in order to get this first point, you have to conduct an annual assessment of the service needs of your program participants. HUD makes 2 points available for projects that have a strategy for providing services to those with histories of unsheltered homelessness and those who traditionally don't engage with supportive services. There's 1 point available for supplementing with resources from other public and private sources. Again, think mainstream benefits. And then 1 point available for demonstrating that the cost per household is reasonable. Okay, we are only accepting rapid rehousing new project applications under the DV bonus because HUD is making that sort of DV bonus set aside available. Rapid rehousing provides supportive services and short or medium-term tenant-based rental assistance that helps an individual or family experiencing homelessness, either with or without disabilities, move as quickly as possible into permanent housing. Rental assistance can only be for housing, can't be used for leasing or operating, and at least monthly case management is required. And because, again, we're only accepting rapid rehousing applications under our DV bonus, you would have to be serving clients that are considered homeless under categories 1 or 4. And then these are the project quality thresholds for rapid rehousing. HUD is saying you have to receive at least 4 out of 6 of these points to be eligible for funding. So those are, first point is for providing tenant-based rental assistance that will help people achieve self-sufficiency within 24 months. They provide 2 points for supportive services that will ensure the participant is able to successfully obtain self-sufficiency and exit homelessness. They provide 1 point for an applicant that has previously operated a homelessness project in which at least 50% of participants exit to permanent housing within 24 months and 50% exit with employment income. If, as an applicant, you do not have that prior experience, you can still get this point by demonstrating that you have a plan in place to operate a project in which half of participants are exiting to permanent housing within 24 months and half are exiting with employment income. There's 1 point available, again, for demonstrating the average cost per household served is reasonable, and then 1 point for supplementing with other resources. We are also accepting supportive services only coordinated entry new project applications, again, only under the DV bonus. These are projects that are designed to implement policies, procedures, and practices that help the CoC's coordinated entry to better meet the needs of homeless folks that are experiencing domestic violence, dating violence, etc. As was noted earlier, CoCs can only submit one SSO-CE project, but we are not limited in the number of rapid rehousing or transitional housing DV bonus projects that we can submit. And again, if you're applying for this type of project, it must serve domestic violence survivors. And for this project type, you have to receive at least 3 out of 4 points. So the first point is for a coordinated entry system that is easily available and reachable for all persons within the CoC's geographic area that are seeking homelessness assistance. The system also has to be accessible for persons with disabilities. So that's our first point. Second point is available for having a strategy to advertise that is designed specifically to reach households experiencing homelessness with the highest needs. There's another point available for having a standardized assessment process. So that would be the process used to determine who has the highest needs. And then 1 point for ensuring that program participants are directed to appropriate housing and services that fit their needs. I just want to note real quick that all the breakdown of these project quality thresholds for each project type are in the RFP, which is already posted online. So you do not have to wait for us to post these slides to review this information that we've just gone over. Okay, now I want to talk about important deadlines. Um, so the most relevant one for folks that are going to be submitting new project applications is Friday, July 10th at 4 p.m. That is when you would need to submit your new project application. I am asking that folks that have questions about a new project application submit those questions no later than noon on Tuesday, July 7th. That will give me some time to respond to those questions before that submission deadline. And then no later than Tuesday, August 11th is when the Delaware CoC has to notify applicants whether their project has been selected. And then the deadline for the Delaware CoC to submit their application to HUD is 8 p.m. on Tuesday, August 26th. I've put my email address here, so if you do have questions about the new project application, please send it to that email address. And don't wait. If you have questions now that we don't get to on this webinar, feel free to email them to me. The application is not posted yet, but I anticipate posting it next week. But I wanted to give folks an idea of the different sections that will be in there. So the first section of the application is a threshold checklist, and these are things that, like if you don't say yes to it, you will not be eligible to apply for funds. So we want to make sure right off the bat that you are an eligible entity type, right? The second section of the application is an overview of the applicant, right? So what is your organization? Where are you located? Then there's a section for the project overview. So that's where you would indicate the project type, whether or not you're applying under the DB bonus, how many individuals you're anticipating to serve under your project. Then there's a certification section. These are things that you have to check off. So for example, in this new NOFO, you have to affirm that you will not engage in that illegal discrimination. So that will be one of the certifications that you have to make. There's also the certification about not enabling illicit drug use. That's another one of the certifications. I think there are about 12 of them in total. Following that is a series of questions to gauge applicant experience and capacity. Then there's a section specific to scope and need, so describing what your project is aiming to address. Then there's a section for the project budget and an accompanying budget worksheet that you'll be able to fill out. This second to last section, I want to be very clear about. So it's titled Supportive Services and Case Management. There's a series of questions under that section that apply to all project types. So you will need to fill out that section that says all project types. Underneath that, there is a section specific to each project type. So if you are applying for a new transitional housing project, you will answer all of the questions under all project types, and then you will answer only the questions that are under the transitional housing header. And you will ignore the questions about the other project types that you are not applying for. And then last but not least is our system performance section. Again, my goal is to have this application posted next week, along with our application rubric. So we're going to be scoring applications out of 100 points because that makes the math easy. As was already noted, HUD will award points to the CoC's collaborative applicant application for CoCs that score projects in such a way that half of the possible points are based on objective criteria and 25% of the possible points are based on system performance measures, or SPMs. So we have intentionally tried to design our new project application and the rubric so that half of the points that you can get are objective and 25% of the points are based on those system performance measures. That is the end of my slides. I'm going to take a breath and wait for questions because I'm sure there are already some. And also,
Anyone have any questions specific for Caitlin and submitting a new project application?
I do. This is Denise again. Um, so my question is, we're going to be a type of transitional housing, but we're also going to be offering supportive services. Do I combine those or do I have to do two separate applications?
That's a great question. So, Denise, when you apply, when we have the application up, you'll also have a budget worksheet that you're filling out as part of that to tell us what your budget would be for the project, like what money you're seeking from the CoC. And when you're creating a transitional housing project, there are multiple types of funding you can ask for. One is to operate the project. So operating costs, things like paying the water bill and the electricity and maintenance. But then there's also a line that you can have in there for supportive services that can pay for case management, that can pay for the cost of food, right? So you'll see a long list of things that can pay for. And transitional housing projects are going to be expected to have services for the folks who are in those programs. And so you'll want to look at what that budget for that line would be. So you don't have to submit two separate ones. That'll be the services line will be an eligible cost in your project application.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. One thing I would like to say about the services piece, if you're submitting or considering submitting a transitional housing project with services or a supportive services only standalone project, you really want to make sure. So HUD is not making additional funding available for that. So you want to make sure that when you're thinking that you're being efficient and thinking about like what are the services that we could pay for that would be the most efficient and effective to help getting people into housing quickly. So I'll provide an example. We know that a lot of families experiencing homelessness, that childcare is a major barrier for them to getting housed. But we also know that childcare is exceptionally expensive and that there are resources in the community sometimes, depending on someone's income, we can go down that rabbit hole another time, that can help folks access childcare. And so is spending limited resources on the cost of childcare a good use of the service dollars in your grant, since there's only so much money we can ask HUD for. So you just want to be thinking about those things. You might look at that and determine it is a good use of funds. I'm not saying it isn't. But that's the type of thing that like the funding committee is going to be looking at when you're submitting your applications. Jacqueline?
Yes, thank you, everyone. This is really very informative and helpful. I have a question. We are a DV agency and do transitional housing and multi-services long-term care. My question is, in our application, could we ask for a portion for rapid rehousing for our clients that are coming in through the system that are homeless?
I
Uh,
wish you could.
along
So
with,
until this year, there was, and we do have two projects in our continuum of care that are funded to be what's called joint transitional rapid. And it's a really great model where folks can come into the transitional, um, but be offered but the organization has the resources and can offer up front, when you're ready to move out, we're here to help you, right? We
yes,
have security deposit, rental assistance money. We can help you kind of move out and make room for someone else as quickly as possible because we have those resources, to do that rapid rehousing component. HUD is not allowing COCs to apply for any new transitional rapid rehousing. So when you're looking at the transitional budget, you're not going to have an option to apply for rental assistance, or to apply for that component of the work, unfortunately.
so it would have to be applied for just for that.
Correct. But we are also, because of the way that HUD's planning to fund things this year, we're not allowing for new rapid rehousing programs to come in and seek funding, unless they're seeking funding through the DV bonus, which may be relevant for you, Jackie, and we can
Yes.
talk more about that.
Okay, I'll
Yep.
follow up with you. Thank
Yep.
you. Mhm.
Are there any other questions before I at least say hello to my renewal projects before we close?
Rachel, it looks like there was a
Mhm.
question in the chat about technical assistance on the grants for some of the new projects, I believe.
So Judson, I saw that. I thought I responded, but it looks like I might not have. As always, you'll reach out to us. Erin is no longer with Housing Alliance, but you can reach out to Caitlin, and Caitlin's going to help answer questions and send you to me or Sophie or get we needed from Framework to answer all your questions. So don't hesitate to reach out. Other questions? Okay, then I'm going to move on to this is going to be real quick because we are having a whole separate meeting renewals. But I wanted to just make sure like you leave this meeting knowing like here is what you should be knowing. The big things that you should know is what I'm calling this slide. So the big things you should know if you forgot already is that 40% of our funds as a COC have to be placed in tier two. And HUD's funding priorities in Tier 2 mean that any rapid or PSH projects are very unlikely to get funded if they are in Tier 2, right? So that means that just like we were talking about last year in 2025, you should be thinking about whether or not you would be interested in voluntarily reallocating your project to be a transitional housing project. Last year, you already went through this mental process. Things may have changed for your organization, so we're asking you to go through this process again of thinking about whether this is something that you are interested in doing and contact me for any questions, conversations at all, and discussions. You really need to have a firm decision about whether, number one, you want to, number two, you're willing to, and number three, you're able to. Because it is possible that you will be told again this year by the CoC that you have to reallocate or your funds will be reallocated for you and given to someone else. In the fall, 30% of our funding was safe. Now it's 60%. So we have more of you are safe than you were twice as many of you actually. Twice as much of the money it can potentially be safe in tier one if it's ranked in tier one. But you want to think about that still because there is still going to be some significant reallocation that is likely to have to happen. Your application for renewal funds is due on July 7th at 4 p.m. You should have received an email from me in the last 2 days with your application, with the information that you need to submit your renewal application to renew funds for the project that you already get funded. We are having a separate renewal project meeting next week on the 24th at 10 a.m. to answer questions you have about the renewal project application process. Uh, so please come to that. And then by Monday, you will be provided with your the 29th, not this coming Monday. So sometime next week or by Monday the 29th, you will be provided with your project profile like you're more accustomed to. That did not go out with the materials that were sent out in the most recent days, but I wanted you all to see what you're going to have to submit and what you're being evaluated on. Your project profile will be sent out to you, but you do have everything you need right now. You have all the data and you have the scoring tool to be able to assess how your project will score on the scoring criteria as it stands. If you think that you are missing something that you need to be able to start assessing how your project will be evaluated and score, please don't hesitate to reach out. So you, as I said, should be deciding if you're willing to voluntarily reallocate and contacting me to talk more about it. You should make sure that you have at least one, but preferably more than one staff person who is able to access eSnaps. So that when HUD says you can go ahead and submit your project applications to us at HUD, you are ready to do that. If you are someone who's thinking about submitting a new application, do know and don't blame us. That after you submit your application to us, you are going to have to complete and submit a separate application to HUD in their online system. And so think about your organization's capacity to do that if your project is selected for funding. We do our best to try to make sure you get as much of a turnaround time as possible from when you're notified that your project's been selected to when that has to be submitted, but it's always a bit of a tight time frame. If you are a renewal agency, make sure that you've checked out and completed your applicant profile in eSnaps. Start working on that renewal project submission application form that I sent out to you over the last couple days. Start making sure you have the required attachments and make sure you have someone attending the project meeting on the 24th. And that's it for me. So we only went 4 minutes over on a 2-hour meeting. How's everybody doing? Are our brains hurting yet? Are we past brains hurting? All right. Jackie's cheering for us. Kathy's giving me a thumbs up. All right. Well done, everyone. Thank y'all for Stacy. Thank y'all for hanging in there. If there are any final questions or things you want to continue to talk about, please feel free to bring them up now.
There was a question in the chat about how many new projects will be selected. So I started to respond. There's not a set number, right? It's going to depend on a variety of factors. Like one of those factors is when we get these new project applications, do they demonstrate that they're going to meet HUD's general threshold criteria as well as the project specific ones, right? Remember when I went through and I said for transitional, you need to have X out of X points. Like we don't want to select applications for new projects that we know HUD is going to say they're not eligible because they don't meet the threshold. So that'll be one factor. It also is just going to depend on what our renewals look like, the reallocation process. Like it's a lot of moving parts.
Yep.
Also,
And as oh, go ahead, Christy.
I was just going to say a reminder to folks. I think you're aware of this, but always just know that just because the CoC selects your project to submit it to HUD does not mean HUD will select it. And so just be aware of that. And I think you guys have a question on your application about budgets and what people, if you're requesting a full amount, but could you make do with less? And we do encourage people to really think carefully and answer that question thoughtfully in case the CoC does not have enough to fully fund all of the applicants it even wants to choose and has to kind of scale back some of your applications.
Other questions? Jackie. I'm
Sorry.
sorry. Can I call you Jackie? You says Jacqueline. I'm just saying Jackie. Correct me, please. Go ahead.
It's Jacqueline. My question is, did you say the request is is up now, or is coming?
Yes, the
I
request for
heard one
proposals.
say it's up, and then I heard just lately that it's going to be up.
So there are two different documents. One is already posted. The new project, or sorry, yeah, new project request for proposals or RFP is already posted. And it contains like all of the project quality thresholds that are specific to each project type that I had on my slides. The actual new project application that you'll have to fill out and submit by July 10th is not on our website yet, but it will be up next week. I am fine tuning it. I want to format it, but that will be coming.
Thank you.
Any
Well,
other?
thank you everyone so much for being here, for being interested in helping people who are experiencing homelessness. And for those of you who are renewals, I look forward to talking to you and hearing from you soon. This concludes our NOFO public meeting. If you want to be in touch with us, you should know how, in terms of having been provided with our emails to reach out for questions or opportunities for technical assistance. So please do that. And thank you so much.